The Urban Guerrilla's Handbook. Winning for the People. A short story by Mystic Alchemist. Copyright 2022-2024. Chapter 1. Paper. Why did I pick it up? To this day that still puzzles me. Not like I made a habit of picking up litter from the pavement. Put it in a bin the regime's advertisements parroted, but last time I looked I wasn't a trained bird. It caught my attention from several paces away, the paper cream, not the crisp white the authorities preferred, and then one pace further and the decision was made. I could always say I was doing my civil duty. Hardly pausing, a hand down and grabbing the stapled sheaves, then holding it in my hand as if it was my own document being hand-delivered somewhere ahead. Pacing on without looking left or right. No one called out. No black helmet tapped my shoulder. Maybe it was safe to look. Cautious glance down in time with my arm lifting that paper up a little, and my heart missed a whole heap of beats while I cursed my foolishness. In that instant I'd read the first of the 2 lines on the cover page. A handbook for the urban guerrilla. My hands were holding dynamite, old and oozing with oily beads of nitroglycerin, waiting for one small bump to explode my life into millions of tiny pieces. I was a dead man walking. If I let my grip loosen, maybe the pages would flutter away and disappear behind a parked car. Or more likely, they would scatter into the path of a black helmet, and if he hadn't seen that it had come from me, he would soon call up the cameras to prove my guilt. Of course a good parrot would go up to the next bin and just poke it in, and continue with his lunch break. No one would know, although there were rumors there were cameras in the bin to film everything that came in, and there were always the street cameras overhead to prove who had done the dropping. Would they believe I hadn't read it? In fact that brought up the real question, was it really a trap to check my loyalty to the regime? If it was, the file would be marked, fail. Even with my heart thumping insistently in my temples, I tried to act cool and calm, holding the papers by my side as though they were only a shopping list, as I walked through the scanners at work. No beeps. No alarms. No one following me close behind. Toward the lunchroom, where the pages were slipped into the plastic bag that acted as my lunchbox. No one said anything and no one seemed to be paying any more attention to me than normal. The minutes slowly turned into hours and nothing happened other than my work output was judged low and below standard, and as a result, my wages would be docked for the afternoon. Reaching to pick my lunch bag brought another pang of fear. Sometimes there were surprise inspections for contraband, but if I tried to move anything now, the room cameras would notice the change and mark me out to check for sure. Fortunately, today was not our section's turn to be checked. Safe still. Takeaway for dinner. That was a rare treat. Not only the cost but the regime didn't like the waste of packing. Well, for us workers anyway. All those collaborators lined up as well as the black helmets, so there were plenty of customers for the takeaway shops. Several patrons and the shop assistant all gave me sour looks, but the assistant still took my credits. There was no way I was going home with that paper. There was no guarantee there were not cameras everywhere, now so tiny as to be almost invisible. The regime loves hiding them. It's an easy way of keeping the slaves under control. A walk to a park would be much safer. Not to hide amongst the trees but toward a lone seat out in the clear grass, as far as possible from any camera hiding place. A place few would want to venture so publicly. Then sitting facing the way any visitor would come, the meal bag open on my lap, and then that paper fetched from my lunch bag as if it was a memo from work to add sob ready for the morning. One bite and I was ready to read. The second line said, "Winning for the people." The type stood out. This was real type, not some copied page. Letters embossed with a writer, the dot for the period punched deep into the paper. I didn't know anyone who still owned a typewriter, and I marveled at the writer who could type it in one go without mistake. That skill had been lost along with countless others. We'd become too soft. Turning the cover page on its staple, there was a full page of type with some close-spaced paragraphs having headings. Riffling the pages I counted 9 in total, all tightly typed. All the pages showed signs where others had read them, smudged marks and some lines underlined in pen, but nothing that would identify who made them. Another bite and I began reading. I read it all in one go, my dinner cooling on the bench alongside. It was clearly an old text, some of the words seemed quaint and some of the ideas suggested would only have worked in a time before mobile phones and internet, but then some ideas were as valid as all time. After the reading I paused to finish my meal, then better prepared, I read it all again to fix the ideas in my mind. Now I needed to lose that paper, but in a way that someone else had a chance of finding it. My plan might not be the best, but it was better than simply leaving it on the park bench. That idea was abandoned when I realized that no other people come near and that would leave the cameras pointing to me if the paper was found by the black helmets. Holding the paper in the same hand that held the packing from my meal, I slowly made my way toward the bin at the entrance to the park. As I was about to drop the lot into the bin, my grip loosened and the paper and packing fell on the ground. When I bent to pick it up, it was only the packing that went into the bin, the paper still on the ground in clear sight for anyone passing. Job done, I made my way home, trying to keep my legs from turning to jelly as I walked. Chapter 2. Glue. The screen was on as usual, but I couldn't tell what program was playing if my life depended on it. All my thoughts were on remembering the book. The story was simple but powerful. It began with setting the scene. In any area, very few people actually ruled the land. Even including police and military, only maybe 1% of the population were in positions of power over the people, and that was even more so in an occupied land like ours. Nearly all the population were content to be ruled with a large percentage not even bothering who was in control, providing they had food and shelter and entertainment. Anyone trying to oppose the ruling regime needed to realize that most of those people will not want to be involved in any uprising to free the land. But those figures gave the way forward for those who want freedom. If only 1 in 100 were involved in ruling, then only 1 in 100 are needed to eliminate those rulers completely. The book proffered the question, are you one of those 1 in 100? Lying sleepless, I thought more on that question. There was no point going further if I wasn't prepared to stand up, but then there was never any question really. I was ready to do my part. If 1 in every 100 people took action, the book said, the world would be changed, but there was one very important condition. Any action you took had to be only done once and never repeated. The reason was simple. Say you took action to disable a military vehicle. Providing you only did it once and then took no more action, there would be no pattern of similar attacks for the regime to focus toward you. Make only one action that was completely out of your usual pattern, and then resume your life as though nothing had ever happened, and if enough people took one action each, the regime must fall. Many of the actions suggested involved things that were impossible for people to get in this land and this time. There was no way we could get guns or explosives or mortars. Even fuels for firebombs were hard to get without permits. That left only a few simple things and one big one. By midnight I had decided on one of the simple things. Something that was possible with materials I could find, and even though it would not cause a major disruption, it would create an annoyance. I would disable a black helmet's vehicle. I'd work out how they worked and decide a plan of attack. It might not seem much, but if 50 other people attacked 50 more vehicles, the regime would quickly lose their ability to respond to further trouble, and this might allow others to carry out bigger actions against the regime. But what exactly could I do? Next lunchtime I visited a car dealer with my cover story ready. It looks like I might be getting a promotion and you'll need a reliable vehicle, the salesman continued for me. Cash or lease? There was hardly any need for me to speak again. My arm led toward a nearby vehicle and the salesman's patter began. What about one like the police use? I managed to get in. I can see you have a good eye for quality, the salesman said, and launched into 1,000 reasons why he should lease me a new vehicle nearly the same. Apparently I couldn't get the exact same model because the regime's cars were made special. Bulletproof glass and armored sides and puncture-proof wheels. When I managed to get away, my hand filled with brochures, it was just as lunch break was ending. I didn't dump the brochures at work. Maybe there would be some useful information to be gleaned amongst that glossy paper. It was on my way home after work that the opening I needed appeared. While aimlessly walking past a black helmet's car, I was taking particular notice of the streamlined sides that extended over the wheels, leaving only the bottom part of the puncture-proof tire visible. Other than the door, the only other opening was the flush flap for the charging point. Unlike the cars in the time of the book, there was no fuel tank to puncture and set light to. No mechanical motor with spark plugs to sabotage. All we had was an underfloor battery and motors in every wheel hub, and the book didn't offer any help about handling that, but I did notice one weakness as I passed. There was a key lock on the charging flap and that wasn't normal. The car salesman had particularly pointed how the charging flap was opened by a switch near the steering wheel. You don't even need to leave your command seat to make it ready to charge, he'd said. So why did the regime do it differently? My suggestion came on the walk home. Their vehicles would be serviced by a bunch of local workers, and by having the charging flap on a separate lock, the locals would never get access to the car interior or the keys to steal them. It was both a strength and a weakness. At least it was a way forward. Now all I needed was glue. The book talked a lot about glue. Useful stuff for annoying an invader. Fill every key with glue and suddenly quick access to something thought safe became a problem, and glue was everywhere and hard to ban. Even my cupboard had some tubes of different half-used glues, but I didn't want to use anything that could be traced back to me, so that meant a visit to the market. Every Saturday there was a market in a large vacant plot on the edge of town. It was there before the regime, and while they didn't like it, they tolerated it to keep the peace. Visiting it was always a risk, you were never sure who was a collaborator or spy, and there was always the possibility of hidden cameras. I prepared carefully. A carry bag filled with popular food items including bars of chocolate. All the traders had credit terminals, but still a portion of the trade was done with barter. Kitchen utensils, clothes, shoes, homemade pickles and jams, old tools, baby supplies, homemade pies. So much to look at and sort through, but my eyes were only on the glue. Is that new? I asked when I finally saw a small tube of superglue amongst a pile of half-empty cans of paint. Still sealed. For any watching spies, I bundled 2 old screwdrivers with the glue and offered my bag to sort out a deal. I'm sure I was ripped off, but I wasn't too worried, and with my new purchases in my bag, I was on my way back home. The small tube of glue was in my pocket as I set off for work on Monday. I'd prepared the glue nozzle by cutting the end, so all that was needed was to pierce the seal and twist the nozzle in the tube and squirt. That was once I had a target. It took 4 days to find a target. The car was parked by the pavement with no black helmets in sight at all. No time to search further around. This needed decisive action. Act and then just walk on and blend in. My hand was shaking as I pierced the small tube while walking, and then twisting the nozzle fully seemed impossible with what felt like a handful of thumbs. Of course the glue leaked out and wanted to stick to my fingers, but I tried to ignore that and kept walking normally. Close alongside the car now, tube of glue in my hand held down as my arms swung, my speed slowing as I tried to get the tube to where the keyway was supposed to be. I'd nearly stopped, but it was there and I was ready, and my hand was out toward the keyway and my fingers were squeezing as hard as they could, the fragile tube quickly collapsing, and then I was past and trying to look innocent even though I had a tube of glue firmly attached to my shaking hand and I was sure the whole regime was right behind me ready to gun me down. Nothing happened. The used glue tube was still firmly attached to my left hand when I got home, the white evidence now hard and set and with no idea how to get it off. Beginning my cleanup with running my hands under warm water, hoping to soften the glue. I'm sure there was a special solvent to soften the mess, but I really didn't have any solvents to try. After half an hour of trying, at least the glue tube was off my left hand, but the skin of both my hands were now bright red from all the effort. Nothing for it but to sit back, watch the screen and relive the adventure in my mind. It was a disaster. In so many ways, it was a disaster, and yet in one way it was a huge success. The one positive was that I was here now in my own room and there were no black helmets banging on the door for me to open up before they broke in. All the time of applying the glue and escaping, my body was demanding me run away as fast as possible, yet I had resisted, held my fear in check and tried my best to act normal. Pride at that. This attempt of an action had proved to me that my inner strength was higher than I imagined, and it was possible for me to carry out a real-life action of resistance, and survive. And then the futility of my action flooded in. I had risked everything for something that might hold up a worker a few minutes. Nothing. So much risked for so little. Part of me wanted to attempt to push the whole event away and forget I had ever begun. I tried and failed, and that was it. But then a thought deep in my soul kept spiraling up, making its presence known, and nothing else I thought would keep it hidden. You try again, the thought said. You know now you have the mental power to conquer your fear. You could carry out one more serious attempt. But the book said only make one action, the other part of me said. But that wouldn't matter if the second action was completely different. By the time I settled into bed, one part of me had won. I would kill a black helmet. I'd never killed anything before in my life. Well, apart from splatting the occasional fly, and there were a few mice, but that was always with a trap, but killing a man was different. The book had said it had to be done quickly, silently, and only when there were no one else at all in sight. These requirements made the task very difficult, but I understood the reasons for them. The book also said that the best weapon to use was the target's own weapon, and the second best was an item that so many normal people used it could not be easily traced to anyone. There was no way to get a black helmet's weapon. I knew nothing about their guns, and I couldn't see myself reaching up to a man and ripping the gun from his holster without him putting up some resistance. That meant I needed to carry my own weapon, and it had to be something that I could be expected to carry, and that was not easy. The other thing I needed was a reason to be around the enemy. And then an alibi if I was caught. My mind was on fire, as though this plan was my whole reason for living. The plan came together in minutes, if only the implementation was so easy. I was going to become a snitch. Not an official one, but a private one. All I needed was a clipboard and a pen for that part, and one of those screwdrivers I'd bought before for my weapon. It was almost too easy. Chapter 3. Screwdriver. Finding regime members and their quislings doing things that were unapproved was easy. Standing and writing their sins in my clipboard while other people watched me was interesting. All knew what I was doing, but no one wanted to acknowledge me lest they become part of my record too. 3 weeks of doing this after work had me a sheaf of indiscretions by people that mattered, and a good idea of where the black helmets would be. Over the time I'd focused my attention to an area where I'd often seen single black helmets, but still I waited to find one completely alone. And then it happened. My clipboard in hand, I scampered behind him, looking both sides to make sure we were alone. Only an arm length between us, I dropped my clipboard, the noise of it hitting the pavement making him stop, turn and bend to reach for it while giving me time to get the screwdriver from my pants pocket. My heart thumping in my chest but my thinking still clear, the handle of the screwdriver firmly in my right hand, I lifted my arm and struck into his shoulder alongside his neck and toward his spine. My blade struck something hard, the shock jarring my hand. The beginning of a bellow against my chest saying he had felt it too. I needed to stop him quickly. Feeling completely in control for the first time in many years, I clamped my left arm around his waist fully and held him toward me hard. One way to keep his weapon away from me, I thought. Right hand jerked free of the first stab point, I pounded it back into his neck with renewed vigor, twisting and turning it inside his black helmeted body, putting all my anger into that one hand and that thin blade. He was trying to speak or yell, hard to know what was coming out of his burbling mouth, the noises changing as I forced that blade in harder, seeking to get it down toward his spine to break him for good. The blade was into the hilt now and he was still moving. I risked another stab. Back and in again hard as I could. An inch away from last time, and this time I felt bones, my force pushing them inside him and me feeling the weight of his body more against my left hand. I'd done it, and I let my hand go, watching him fall in a pile in front of me. Blood. It was everywhere. The book hadn't mentioned what to do with the blood. In movies, blood oozed out slowly. In books they always had time to wipe away the evidence, but this wasn't like the movies or books. How could a man have so much blood? My hands covered. My face and clothes spattered. And my blade still in his neck, wedged in bone and slippery with squirting red evidence. My plan of escape impossible now. I did the only thing I could do. Getting on my knees alongside the body, I yelled, "Help! Police! Help!" Chapter 4. Interrogation. "I've tried to resuscitate him," I said to the first black helmet who responded, 2 bloody handprints over my victim's chest as proof. "But I think he's lost too much blood." They didn't say anything until I was handcuffed, then one of them got my clipboard and began reading it. "That yours?" "It is." He was just there like that. They didn't care. I was guilty and they took me off before anyone came to tend to the body. 2 hours in the lockup, even though it felt like a day. I know they thought the waiting would soften me up for their grilling, but it did the reverse. I had my fear under control and my story strong in my mind. At least they let me clean my hands before I was ushered into an interrogation room, bright lights and a stainless table with my clipboard the only decoration. Sitting opposite me was an older man trying his best to look like I was guilty and his life would be easier if I confessed right now. "Who you working for?" he insisted, pointing to my clipboard. "Worth more than my life to say," I said, leaning back in my chair in what I imagined would be the stance of a man with high contacts behind him. "We have ways of finding out. But I've been sworn to secrecy. I can't say." I had them. My clipboard showed offenses that would get some of the regime in trouble, and the only person who would benefit from my clipboard was someone high up in the regime. They were in a real bind. Then the questions turned to the murder, but I held my line of having arrived to see the man on the ground and then trying to help. That action fitted perfectly with me being a stooge of the hires of the regime, and the interrogation was not really very intense. "We need to keep this clipboard as evidence," my interrogator said. "Of course," I said, knowing he wanted to hide the evidence against his friends. And that was it. I was free. Of course they made it clear that I was still a suspect and shouldn't leave the country, but I had no intention of doing that. Next day at work there was a new man in the office. Not that he did much work, his real job seemed to be watching me. It didn't matter, there would be nothing for him to find. I was going to be a model worker and citizen. I had done my action, and it was enough. I kept watching the news to see the report of my action. It was 3 days later when the death was reported. A peacemaker collapsed and a loyal citizen attempted to resuscitate him, but it was in vain. Short and sweet, and completely false. And that made me remember other reports like that, and over the weeks I saw so many more the same. These invaders must be an unhealthy lot, they seemed to be dropping dead all over the city. Viva la Revolution. The Urban Guerrilla's Handbook. Winning for the People. A short story by Mystic Alchemist. Copyright 2022-2024 Mystic Alchemist. All rights reserved. Written in Australian English. This book is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places and incidents are either a product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual people living or dead, events or locales is purely coincidental. Cover and text written and assembled by hand without use of artificial intelligence.